So I think you've all got the piece of paper in front of you in terms of what this is all about, but I would like to introduce you to our panel here. We've got Peter Brabeck, we've got Olivia Colomb, Do-Young Shim, Pravin Gordon, Matthew Kirk, Maria Ramos, and I think in terms of kicking off this issue about the G20 and Africa, I think we'd like to start off with the French comment and just sort of get a sense from you as sort of the current chair of the G20 and the G8 on where you see and what you would like to achieve from your current leadership of the G20.
Right. Can you hear me? Yeah, fine. Thank you. Thanks, Robin. Thanks for the invitation to this session. And hello to the audience, and in particular to some of the well-known faces that I see here in the first row. This year is a very special year for France, as we have the task of having a double presidency, actually, the one of the G20, which obviously is for us the most important one, but also that of the G8. And I mention it because the way we see the agenda regarding Africa is very strongly, we hope, in coherence with what we try to do in the G20 and how we differentiate it with what we try to do in the G8. The G20 is, I think, a great success, has been a great success so far. We have been very able at answering the crisis. But now the challenge, as we all know, is also to succeed in a post-crisis era that is opening. We think that one of the key elements is to improve the representation of Africa in the G20. That is why we very much welcomed and actually supported the idea that we should have two more African guests in the G20 summit as from now, because only South Africa is a member, and is obviously it's an insufficient representation of Africa in this group. So we will have two more African states.
Who?
That will be the president of the African Union, Equatorial Guinea, and the president of Nepal. Actually, we are following the resolution taken in Kampala last year, whereby African states decided of their representation to the G20. So that was the first element for us that was important to solve, which was a better representation of Africa in the G20. That also is a link to what we think as France, but also many others around the table, that Africa should be better represented in global governance in general. But for coming back to the G20 agenda, we have a number of things that we need to do. The achievements that are expected are high, but I would first like to say again thank you to Korea, because they have done a great job last year, and especially allowing to adopt a development agenda that is quite ambitious.
Well, I think let's bring in the Korean representative here, and let's talk about some of the lessons you learned, and how do you try and encourage France to perhaps not make this just promises on a podium, that perhaps some action will be taken? What are the lessons you've learned, and what suggestions would you offer France?
First of all, thank you for complimenting G20 summit in Seoul. Seoul Consensus Development for Shared Growth is historical in a way. Number one, physically, G20 was held in a country not G8 member. As a very poor country to OECD transformation in short period of time. And then also development consensus tells that perhaps Washington consensus, leaving everything free market system, didn't work. In other words, donor-oriented development has been proven not quite working compared to recipient-oriented aid assistance. And I think emerging markets like Korea and China shows that donor but recipient-oriented, somehow government involvement in development process is very, very important. And I think heads of G20 states agreed, okay, Washington consensus didn't work, so should we try this new format? And I think it's very important. So what do we expect from France? France, as he said, France was colonial G8 power and also G20 power. Yes, they wear both hats. And we have created 9 pillars, and it's my understanding France is going to concentrate 2, that is infrastructure and food security. If I have 1 more minute, could I go on to this French involvement? I think it's my understanding, President Sarkozy said, you know, I'd like to see some 3, at least regional infrastructure development plan before Cannes conference, and with rapid financing. When you say rapid financing, everybody starts, what is rapid financing? You know, we all worry about what's there, but financing, the end of the day, it's who is going to finance with what money. And ODA is falling down, 0.07% of GNI is not doing very much. So I think rapid financing, I have a question, what do you mean by rapid financing? Or does it mean innovative financing? If that comes to that in a period, I will speak. Thank you.
Let's ask Pravin Gordhan, the Finance Minister of South Africa. What does Africa want? What does South Africa want from this? Do they expect anything from the G20?
Yes, we definitely do. In the first instance, the G20 meeting at a leadership level was an interesting response and experiment with a form of global governance. And it's still in its nascent stages, but our expectation would be that we more clearly recognize that the world is a complex place, but which requires global governance institutions to be both set in place and to work. Secondly, in the Pittsburgh communique, the G20 leaders made a commitment to getting the finance ministers to work on the framework for strong, sustainable, and balanced growth, which was essentially saying to the world that we are not going to be only dominated by the developed countries, that we need to find a more equitable path to growth and development around the world. Now, what has happened in the recent past is that this framework has been turned into a technical exercise about what you measure in respect of current account balances and so on, and become part of a geopolitical tug-of-war as opposed to developing the grand idea which was developed in Pittsburgh, which says how do we have a better world and how do we have a more coherent approach to growth and development. The third is we must compliment our Korean colleagues for very strongly introducing the development component onto the G20 agenda. And our expectation is that that will be taken further, that the 8 sort of tracks that our Korean colleague speaks about, in particular the infrastructure track, will actually materialize into investments, into particular forms of financing and concrete delivery in terms of projects on the African continent. One last point is that currently ODA is going to start drying up. Alternative forms of financing need to be found. And here again, our French colleagues are willing to explore new ways of financing development around the world, whether that be global financial tax of one form or another, or any other mechanism. But clearly, as South Africa is the host of COP17 this year, and the world is talking about setting up a green fund, one of the most intriguing issues that within the G20 and outside the G20 we need to resolve is where does the money come from? And so overall, our expectation is that there should be less focus on national interest, more focus on global interest, that we find areas of cooperation amongst the countries, just as we did during the crisis, and that leaders and other member countries within the G20 find that collective will again to demonstrate to the world that it can rely on the G20 for answers on some of the key questions that the world faces.
Thank you. We're going to shift now to some representatives from the private sector, and let's start with Peter Breivik. What is your comment in terms of just giving a sense of where you stand, sir?
If you allow me, I would like to quote the President Lee when he finished the G20 in Seoul. And he said, after the crisis, financial crisis, governments have taken the lead in the economic recovery with coordinated public policy initiatives, including a substantial increase in public spending. He followed, now the time has come for the private sector to assume the leading role in generating sustainable growth and employment. I think this was the most encouraging outcome of Seoul, and I only hope that this spirit will be maintained in the forthcoming G20 meeting. And I think if we are talking about inclusive growth and those things, I think it is very interesting if you analyze what has happened in Africa in the last couple of years. We were looking at the 35 high-growth countries in Africa and compared them to the 15 countries which were the one who was growing the lowest. Interesting, like it was mentioned before, it was those countries that received most of aid which was growing the slowest. As a matter of fact, of these 15 African countries which increased the foreign aid from 6% of GDP to 9% of GDP, were the one that grew the least. And those who diminished the foreign aid from 3.2% to 2.5%, they were growing much, much faster, and are today the fastest growing countries in the world. I think it is important, this message, to hammer it back into the G20, because otherwise we will go back and will believe that the future of Africa depends on the amount of aid money which is coming in from outside.
Well, let's shift it to Maria Ramos here. And you see a lot of the capital flows coming through ABSA. Where's it coming from and where's it going?
Well, I think the discussion so far has been about the role of the G20, and I think we did see great progress in the G20 coming out of Seoul, particularly the focus on the promotion of what has been termed, and I think a very big shift, as Minister Gordhan has pointed out, in the agenda, and well done to the leadership to move the agenda to promote global, sustainable, and inclusive growth. And I think the role of the private sector in that is obviously very, very important. And critical to that is the focus on infrastructure. I think what we're starting to see in Africa, and you see it also in the theme of this WEF, is the focus on Africa being open for investment. And in order to be open for investment, we need to have infrastructure, and we're starting to see those investments in infrastructure, but we still lack the capacity to actually action some of the investment that is required in infrastructure. And I hope that the discussions, and hopefully the French presidency this year, is also going to take the G20 agenda to the actionable in terms of what it means to really make the investment in that infrastructure. It is about financing, but it's about much more than that. It's about the systems that you need to have in place. It's about the legal systems. It's about sorting out some of the cross-border issues that we still have need to resolve to facilitate investment. And so, you know, we are seeing a lot of the flows coming in, not just from the traditional countries that many African countries have done business with, much stronger flows with Asia. But importantly, we do also need to see inter-Africa trade.
But there's a huge growth there, isn't there?
And there is a huge growth. But if you really want to see greater growth, you need the infrastructure. You need the roads. You need the ports. You're going to need the rail systems in place. You need the air traffic to become much more visible and much more active than what it is at the moment.
And I think the practical implications of what you're saying are perhaps felt most aptly by Matthew Kirk there, in trying to sort of run a cell phone network in some of the most remote parts of the continent. I mean, is that for you the biggest issue, infrastructure? Or you've completely bypassed it and built your own?
Well, we do have to build our own,
yeah.
And they're very substantial investments. I think our experience is that doing that and then bringing the services that we're able to bring does unlock a tremendous potential in the economy and in social and economic development for private individuals and small businesses as well as for large businesses. Very much as Maria was saying, I welcome enormously the focus on Africa, the focus on investment in Africa, and the focus on infrastructure in particular. But I think one of the areas where the G20 could add enormous value is looking at the factors which make a business case for investing in Africa more difficult, and Maria mentioned some of them. It's things like judicial systems, non-transparent administrative systems, lack of capacity in regulatory bodies, ways to tackle corruption. All these sorts of things increase the risk profile of an investment in Africa against an investment somewhere else. And if we could have a really concentrated effort to tackle some of those, then I think the positive stories that we're already seeing could become much, much more, and Africa could become really open for investment. And that dynamic would help to tackle some of the infrastructure problems, potentially relatively quickly.
And I think that plays into all sorts of levels, and no matter how many interviews I do or panels I chair, it keeps on coming back to the nitty-gritty issues like that. Visas, for example, that doesn't just stop people coming in, it stops this intra-African trade. It's about business environments that are enabling, about not having red tape and regulation, and it's the small things that I don't know if you would like to comment on this, that really hinder any sense of development going forward when it comes down to the practicality of the issue.
I think those points are fairly made, but what we need to be careful about is that we don't generalize them. Africa has 53 countries at
Absolutely.
this point in time. Now, surely we can't say that all 53 countries are paralyzed by these factors. There are any number of multinational businesses today that are and have been associated with African countries for 50 years and more. There are at least 10 to 15 countries in Africa that work, where the courts work, the regulatory systems work, and so on. I can give you examples of developed countries where the red tape might be worse than in some of the African countries. But they have the historical advantages that they have. So I think these are, in fact, important factors, but the business case for investment in Africa is, in a sense, being made by history itself. That as we see the different and disparate levels of growth around the world, we are beginning to see the emergence of multipolarity. We're beginning to see the focus shifting to Africa and the possibilities it has to offer. These are not short-term possibilities. These require a 20, 30, 40-year commitment to this particular continent. And I'm sure that there are business leaders who begin to see Africa in that way, who recognize that if we take a global view of the economy, we've got to start investing in places that will give us returns 10, 20 years down the line. From an African government point of view, certainly from a South African point of view, we will do everything to reduce red tape. Sometimes it goes up, sometimes it comes down. But none of these are necessarily totally inhibiting factors, as banks have shown, construction companies have shown, telecommunications companies have shown as well, because they're talking with their feet in terms of the kinds of investment that need to be made. What we do need, perhaps, is a better and more straightforward dialogue between the private sector and ourselves to say, what are the major hurdles that we need to cross? How do we work with each other to get rid of them so that, in fact, we can create better conditions? I think we need to be careful about the development aid component that Peter mentioned. I don't think any African country wants to be dependent on aid forever. But aid does play an important part in low-income countries at this point in time. And we need to get the right and sustainable balance between aid and what in the G20 we've been calling resource mobilization. Developing the capacity of countries to raise their own taxes, to widen their tax bases, and to generate their own revenue at the same time. And how we get that balance right with private sector investment as well is part of the challenge and the exciting challenge that we have as we go forward.
I'd like to bring Olivia in here. When we look at this topic and we sort of talk about G20's leaders expressing a strong commitment to ensure accelerated growth, is it perhaps one way to turn it around and say how to ensure that the G20 is part of this staggering growth that is already taking part in Africa? And it's less about how to ensure it's happening and how to actually get something out of it yourselves and to ensure that Africans get as much as they can out of it.
No, I agree, and I actually agree with everything that was said before. Really, the focus on infrastructure, notably, is a very strong one, a very important one, and it makes a link between private sector involvement and actually public policy. Because the high-level panel of experts for infrastructures is actually composed mostly of private sector managers. And the chair of this panel is an African citizen, Tidjane Thiam, and 1/3 of the panel is actually composed of African or people from African origin. This is a choice that we made to make sure that the infrastructures group would be focused, would give a priority to Africa in its works. And having said that, a number of other issues are of course related, and that is why we endorsed a very ambitious action plan on anti-corruption. And that is why also we would like to bring in more things on transparency, for example. And as you might know, President Sarkozy has expressed his intention to have a European law on mandatory reporting by companies investing in the natural resources sector, so that they would, country by country, say what they pay, actually. And they would have to do it. For every company listed in Europe, they would have to say what exactly they are doing. So basically, all of that is going in the right direction. And maybe to answer a bit more accurately your question, the business summit will also be very much about all those issues and how to bring in Africa into the global economy, how to ensure that actually it brings its potential, which is huge, as we all know, to foster and improve global growth. It's really not only now an issue of developing Africa, it's also an issue for the whole of the world. Rebalancing growth is a very high topic in the G20 agenda, and it's really about developing Africa. So all of this, I would certainly think that we will try to make huge progress in Cannes at the summit at the beginning of November.
I would like to ask Mrs. Do, just in the South Korean experience and the staggering growth in the last 30, 40 years in Asia, what are the lessons perhaps that the Asian tigers can teach the African lions, as they've been called? And is it infrastructure? Is it governance? What is the critical thing that the Asians did that changed this all from policy into practical implementation?
I think it's a combination of everything you have just said. But I think the most important thing is this emerging economies, including Korea, how we could fight poverty from $89 to $20,000 is there was partnership among business sector, government, and will of people. First of all, population has the will to fight with poverty. And how do they do it? Through education, whatever, they have to have this will, and combination of these three. And I don't think Asian tigers has anything to teach African lions, because I think African lions doing fine. I don't think they have to be, afraid of what they have. Competitive advantage Africa has. It's not known to the West. And how is the West treating African affairs, African status quo is, again, I like to bring it out because I travel to Africa 10 or 11 times a year. I go. Cape Town is, I don't consider this Africa. I go much, much more, and there's no difference between sewage and water. Okay? But see, what I'm trying to say is, Africa, how West is treating African really affair is this. When I was coming here, I was doing some research, and one of my staff was doing research, and he said, Ambassador, I found something very interesting. What is it? He put it in Google saying, African competitive advantage. And then Google says back, you mean America's competitive advantage? Just like you are correcting, when you misspell something, you're correcting. That's how Google reacts. Yeah. So I think what I'm trying to say is West is truly looking at what's really going on. I come here for the past 15 years, Africa's changing. We should be optimistic. Africa has young labor, cheap labor, and they have a natural resource. They have everything the West wants. It's a matter of prioritize. Government has to prioritize. We talk about corruption. I think it takes two to tango. And China, I'm very happy, China being our giant neighbor, I'm very happy they just adopted a law that you don't bribe foreign officials or international organization people to get your business done. It's very important that China adopted that law, that they'll be punished.
I don't know who would like to go first, Maria?
No, I think all of those points are exceedingly important. The other thing that strikes me listening to our conversation, and I don't know, Mr. Colomb or Minister Gordon, maybe you can say something about this, but it strikes me as interesting that when we talk about Africa in the G20, we kind of focusing on one or two parts of the discussion in the G20. But Africa can't be seen outside of what's going on in the global economy. And my understanding of the agenda in the G20 is that it's quite a big agenda. And one of the big areas of work in the G20 is actually the reform of the international monetary system. And it's not because it's a fetish and because we've been talking about it for as long as, a lot of people, have been much more involved in it for much longer than I have, but I've certainly been involved with it for almost 2 decades now. But it is because it is important for the stability and the growth opportunities of the global economy, and the better the global economy does, the better Africa can do. And Africa has all the potential, and we've seen that potential develop and grow, and people look at Africa with different eyes and look at the opportunities here. And the great opportunity that we have here, and one day, I have a dream that one day when you input Africa and competitive advantage into Google, it's not going to be diamonds or gold or iron ore. It's going to be the fact that we've got people. And we've got talent on this continent, and that we can develop that talent, and that's our competitive advantage. Equally, if we don't develop and start investing in education, we've got a problem, because we've got a very young population. So when I look at the agenda for the G20, Minister, I think Africa has a role to play in that global reform agenda. It has, obviously, we have to come back to what's going to make Africa successful, and it is all of those issues. It's around the development of the infrastructure. We have a tendency to talk about these things for too long, but it is about that partnership to get that infrastructure going between the private and the public sector. And it is about getting some of these other things right, and it's about understanding the differentiation between all the countries on this continent and what we need to do to unblock some of the aspects of it. But I'd hate to think that we were just targeting one or two things for Africa in the G20 agenda. I'd worry about that.
I don't know if Peter wants to respond, or do you want to go there first?
No, I was listening very carefully here. Infrastructure and all these things is all nice, open to investment and financing in the legal system. But I think Maria was touching now on a point which I think is the most critical one. And this is the education of the people and the preparation of the people in order to be able to absorb investments. I'll give you a good example. If you build a railway from the east to the west of Africa, and this railway is being constructed by foreign workers, you have built a great infrastructure. You don't have afterwards the engineers, the people who you need in order to be able to maintain this railway. So as long as, and that's why I come back about this donor mentality, as long as you have a donor mentality which does not include the most important thing, which is the transfer of know-how, of knowledge, of technology, you will not have a base in order to be open for investment. And if you ask me what is the difference, if there is one, or what is the reason why the Asian tigers became so strong, look how they looked upon, first, education of their people, and secondly, how they were eager to get the intellectual property of the West. I mean, we were all, excuse me, almost cursing, because we know every car would be taken apart, every product, every machine would be taken apart. They would be learning what is the technology behind, what is the intellectual property. And then they were able to do it themselves. And that's why I said it is so important that we strengthen the educational base of it, that we introduce systems like apprenticeship, because I think even today there would be enough jobs available if we find the right people at the continent. And I think this is the most critical issue for the future of Africa.
I would agree with Peter, Mrs. Doe, and Maria as well. So I think in the first instance, let's go back to the first point, that the global conditions are such that they begin to bring the focus of the world onto Africa. Secondly, we accept that none of us in this continent, certainly not in South Africa, want a donor-dependent mentality at all. I think there's a lot of pride in the African continent. There's a lot of willingness to now be independent and to stand on our own and to do all of the things that we've now talked about. The question is, how do we get that lead, which takes us out of the era of the last 50 years into a completely different era? So the points about education, absolutely right. And looking forward, it's just the demographic advantage that the African continent will have over the rest of the world virtually.
But I think the concern is that there's this, obviously, this youth belt, there's a huge potential for a continent full of young people. But the concern is that everybody is unskilled, unemployable, never mind. And I think that maybe is what Peter is touching on. How South Africa is particularly vulnerable here. I think there's one statistic that out of the 1 million children who start school, only 9,000 of them by the end have a matric distinction in maths. So South Africa is one of the most developed economy in the region is already lagging on that issue. I mean, it's obviously fundamental, but how do you fix it?
Well, for a start, we've got to stop talking about it and agree that we've got to do something about it.
Well,
Secondly, as governments and as societies, as our Korean colleague pointed out, we've got to have the determination to say, let's get education right. In our country, we have challenges within that system. Partly it's historical, partly it's to do with mindsets both within the community and within the teaching fraternity. But it's something that this government is certainly committed.
But if South Africa can't do it, what about Gabon? What about Equatorial Guinea? I mean, I think it's a huge challenge.
No, we agree it's a huge challenge. Bringing down apartheid was the biggest challenge that we had in this country. We brought it down, and we now have democracy for 17 years. We've got to now build on that democracy and recognize that both within South Africa and within the African continent, education will be a challenge, building resilient institutions will be a challenge, ensuring that governments and societies have the focus and the will to get these things done will be a challenge. But it's not a theoretical challenge, it's a challenge that on a day-to-day basis we're already meeting in many ways. But we're also confronted with, let's call it the Google paradigm issue. which is there are sections, I think, around the world who've recognized Africa's potential and are relating to it on its terms and beginning to develop it. On the other hand, there's still some who would be sitting within an old paradigm, with all of the skepticism that goes with the old paradigm as well. Now go back 20 years and ask yourselves about China and the approach to China, and who were the people who took the initiative to build relationships with China, and who were the people who said, we'll sit and wait, and where are each of them today? So similarly, within the African context, there are those sorts of challenges as well. So there's no doubt we have huge challenges. But we also have a set of structural changes, which is saying that, for example, when any investment happens in the African continent, we want jobs created, as Peter said, in the African continent. We want training institutions and capability built on the African continent as well. We want growth not just to be calculated and observed, as macroeconomists often do, on GDP numbers, but we now want to give some meaning to the concept of inclusive growth, which means how do you share the benefits of growth? How do you reduce inequality as a result of the quality of growth that you actually have in a society? Now, these are all becoming conversations within the G20 as well. And I think they're challenging not just Africa, but indeed the world, because joblessness is not a South African problem or an African problem today. At different levels, we have the more serious end of the problem, but the United States is also looking for jobs. Much of Europe is also looking for jobs. Spain has an unemployment rate of 21.5% today. So when we sit as finance ministers, some of us are sitting together and saying, how do we solve this problem? We might be at different levels of development, but we seem to be confronted with very similar structural issues around the globe. For the G20, the challenge is, can we focus on this as a system and as a systemic problem and find some systemic answers to this whilst we look at country-based answers as well? And that's the challenge that within the G20 we need to take on.
I want to just bring in Matthew Kirk here from Vodafone. I mean, you're the man, in one sense, that is connecting most Africans. And what are the things that you found hinder or sort of push this growth? And particularly this issue about working across borders, across industries, across sectors, and the lessons you've learned.
I think, I mean, one of the sort of themes of this discussion has been about the balance of difficulty of doing it and opportunity. And the opportunity does seem to us to be enormous, because the type of technology that we're installing in Africa now is identical to the type of technology we're installing in Europe or in Asia or wherever. There is no difference. And what we see as you bridge the north-south digital divide, and as you, within a country, bridge the digital divide between cities and urban areas, there are lots of people there who are very capable of taking advantage of the new capabilities. And if you can start to link together the ability to move information and knowledge around the place, which is the sort of core of what a communication system provides, with, as we've been able to do in some African countries, the ability also to move small amounts of money around the place, micropayment systems and so forth, you start to create a potential actually to bypass a lot of the things that Europe needed to do over a century, and to jump Africa forward to be in a very similar position to the rest of the world. And I think the education challenge is a huge one, but I'm less pessimistic about it, because our experience is that there are a lot of people here in Africa who are very capable of picking up new capabilities and improving their lives with them. And people learn from each other. So there may well be formal educational challenges, but there are some tremendous entrepreneurial examples of what you can do out there. One of the lessons that we've learned is that it's linking different business sectors together which can deliver a really big result. And that's a challenge for us in the business community, because we have to align different business models and build trust between companies in different sectors to come together to create a wider impact. But if you can do that, the payback can be absolutely tremendous. And we've seen that in a number of cases in Africa.
Okay, you can have your response, and I'd love to open it to the floor. So I don't know if would you like to say something, Mrs. Doe, and then we'll open it to the floor.
I'd like to say this, all these projects and everything, we need budget. We need financial revenue. And I think we have to make it very, very clear that leaders of G8 and at the United Nations, all the G8, G20 countries, heads of state, they promised they'll bring up 0.07% to ODA. Have they kept it? No. It's going to be better? No. It's going to get worse because West economic situation gets better, it gets worse, then it affects. Then we have to find creative, innovative financing. And I know French is very good at it. Your foreign minister Blatz, he had a surcharge for airplane ticket. It gains $400 million a year, and $2 billion for the past 5 years. It deals with malaria, tuberculosis, all these diseases. So creative, innovative financing is very important. So what we're saying is, France is again proposing charge 0.001% for international bank transfer. It will bring $42 billion a year. We are spending $38.52 billion to Africa for ODA. It's bigger. Then we can accomplish MDG goals, which I'm a part of it. So I'm very much looking forward French leadership of 2011, that whether France can really make 2011 a creative year of innovative financing. And said rapid financing, I asked that question to French colleague, what do you mean by rapid financing? That's what your president supposed said it. So what is rapid? Is it different with creative financing?
I think we can ask him.
Well, thank you.
And then one last thing before I say.
Right.
I really hope France took over 2011. I really hope they will do well with the business summit. When London, we had 20 business people came. In Toronto, 40 came. And Seoul, 120. 120 companies out of Fortune 500. It's very important. Perhaps business leader has more continuity than political leaders. Presidents, ministers come and go. But as chairman of CEO, you stay there forever, right? So it's very important. It's very important to get them involved. Really create partnership and do something about development.
I'd like to open the floor, unless you really want to say something quickly.
Right, just a very brief answer. First, to thank you for your words, actually. I was afraid at the very beginning of your intervention, but turned out to be very nice. Actually, just a quick answer on the business summit, because you mentioned it. Maurice Lévy, whom many of you know, will be in charge of this business summit with the employees organization in France, and it will be taking place in Cannes on the 2nd of November, so we will allow also for leaders to meet with the business community. Just a very brief thing, we asked Bill Gates this year, because we know we are trying to push this agenda of innovative financing, but I also know that there is a lot of questions about why we do that, and I know that a lot of our African friends are even suspecting that we might want to do that just to escape from our commitments, which is not the case. I have to say it loud and clear here again. We are stuck at 0.5%, which is not enough. It's not at the level that we hope. But we still are at this level, even in times of very, very difficult budgetary constraints. We haven't sacrificed at all ODA, and we don't intend to do that. And certainly we will continue to call for others to put their money in ODA. So Bill Gates will nicely report on the financing for development this year. And I think it's a very crucial thing to do. It's not only innovative financing, it's part of it. It's how you get your, how you actually reach your objectives and keep your commitments through ODA, through aid, through investment, private sector investment, but also multilateral investment and so on. So really, we are looking for this report with great expectations. And we are willing to have a very, very strong debate on this. We need the support of you, Korea, but also of Africa, because if we don't get it from Africa, then I don't think we have a lot of hope to go anywhere, actually.
Can we open it up to the floor? Anyone interested in asking some questions? There we are. Well, there's a sir there. Coming up behind you.
Hello. I've agreed with almost everything the panel has said, but a point comes to mind. In the short term, you need physical infrastructure to attract investment. In the long term, you need soft infrastructure, education being the most critical part of that. But I have not heard from any African leader what their vision is about education, and nor have I heard any African leader put that as the centerpiece of their policy.
Would anybody like to answer that?
Yes. I'm not certainly African leader, but I think I can talk about it because I am Billion Development Goals Advocacy Group, and I am with Sheikh Moza of Qatar. We are in charge of cluster called education. Yes, there are 67 million children who doesn't have access to primary school. But if you look at African countries like Senegal, they're spending 35% of national spending for education. I think African leaders really start to recognize without smart citizen, the development will not go far. And the reason I'm in there because Korea, we don't have oil, we have nothing. We have no coal, no nothing natural resources, but we are where we are simply because we got educated. So I know that African leaders are very, very serious about this, giving education.
I think in the South African context, education is one of the top 6 priorities of this administration. We have amongst the highest spend on education in terms of proportion of GDP. Where we are weak is on the quality of the output that we have from our education system. We've also decided to make huge investments in the training and development area and to revitalize many of our training institutions as well. Much of that work is happening over the last 18 months and will continue for the rest of our 3-year term. So the focus is there, and I can see you shaking your head. It needs to become something that is more scalable, something that is a lot more visible, and I think we need other changes in society which enable the results of the education system to be shown as well, which is, again, a missing factor. So we would agree with you that the jury might well be out. I think the intent is there in many parts of the continent. We've got to give it a bit of time to begin to show some of the results. Nobody will debate with you about the importance of education and the development of skills and the transfer of technology and the development of our own technological and innovative capacity as well. The question is, how do we get there? There will be a minority of examples where there will be negligence in that regard, and I think those will find themselves at the back of the queue ultimately.
Maria?
I think it is widely acknowledged that this is a big challenge for all of us, but it also is one of those areas where the private sector has acknowledged that the partnership between the private sector and the public sector is fundamentally important, and we're seeing more and more of those partnerships come to the fore between various parts of the private sector and the public sector at all levels of the education system and across the board, from primary to secondary to tertiary education to skills and development, and both in terms of all the way from ranging from the adoption of schools to scholarships to training and development to what we prioritize as part of our CSI programs. And the numbers are growing. I think the last number I saw in terms of private sector investment in over and above our own training and education spend was something in the order of 1.7 billion rand per annum. So that's not a small amount of money from a CSI point of view in education and training. So that's over and above what people do as companies in terms of investment in skills training and development. but it is an area that everybody has recognized as a priority. Much more needs to be done.
I just wanted to take the point up of the Korean representative and also the French representative that made a point that it's important to bring business to the G20. But I think you should not forget that the workers contribute tremendously in terms of their pension funds that makes funds available for investment. And then secondly, they also contribute tremendously when it comes to paying taxes. In this country, for instance, the workers' contribution in terms of taxes is more than what business are contributing. So I think it's very important that you should strike a balance. And I think thirdly, the point is that workers have suffered a lot because of the amount of people that were retrenched as a result of the speculative capitalism that have actually brought us into the problem in the first place.
Can you just identify yourself, sir? And
My
just
name
also
is Dennis George, and I'm the General Secretary of EDUSA.
Great. Do you have a question? Okay. Just also, can you identify yourselves before you do it? I don't know, we've got the lady there, sorry, went first, and then we'll come to you, sir, if that's okay. Thank you.
Minister Gordon, I know that I can't hold you accountable for education.
Can you just identify yourself?
Sorry, Sula Proxinos, International Housing Solutions. I've been asked to stand, so I will comply. I know this is not part of your portfolio, and certainly the parts of your portfolio, both current and historic, have been superbly run. But as a representative of Cabinet, you made the point that the outcomes on education are poor. And I think one of the things that we've seen a lack of is the political will to make some very significant changes. And I take the point about Senegal and with the percentage of their GDP that they're spending on education, and I take the point of how much we're spending in South Africa. But without the will to tackle things like the teachers' unions, I really don't think that we're going to get to those sort of outcomes, no matter how much money we funnel into the top, because the bottom's just pouring out.
Well, thank you for the question, but it's you're repeating what I said, which is essentially that those are some of the challenges that we have. And as I said, give us maybe another year or two, and hopefully we can produce some results in that regard. There's very active engagement with the teacher unions in South Africa, and hopefully we can reach an understanding that unless we get a genuinely workable partnership going between government, the teaching fraternity, and communities, we aren't going to be able to fulfill the promise that education has for us. The money is there. The question is, as we've all said, what we get as a result of that.
Thank you. Mark Sussman from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And a big thank you to the panel for a very stimulating discussion so far. And just building off a couple of the points made, I think for those of us who are very interested in issues of development and health and issues that Africa often places disproportionate challenges, we've been incredibly lucky in the leadership both of the Koreans last year and the French this year in the G20, because there really is no guarantee that the G20 as an institution, as a group of nations, would take these issues as a priority, and that leadership really has come from the respective countries. And as Olivia has already said, Mr. Bill Gates has been asked and accepted a request from President Sarkozy to work on a report on all aspects of financing for development, including innovative financing, which he is work on now and will present to the group of 20 in November in Cannes. And so in that sense, I think it's a very powerful and inspiring foundation, and great to see, and we're very happy to be part of it. I think the challenge, which is still yet to be proven for the G20 as an institution, as a collective, is whether it can actually come together as a group to take collective action on these kind of issues, as opposed to simply register and note how important they are and why attention should be paid. And so I'd like to just ask the panel back, the respect of how optimistic they feel that really this can be turned into real concrete commitments and action in specific areas, and what they think needs to be done or needs to happen to encourage that. Thank you.
Who would like to take?
Well, I think this is a very, very, very sensitive question you're bringing up, frankly speaking, because I personally have doubts that the G20 has a legitimacy to make decisions. I don't know where this legitimacy would be coming from. I mean, the G20 was the result of a General Assembly of the United Nations, which got frustrated, went 200 kilometers away and created the G20, because action was necessary, and the one institution which has a legitimacy was not able to come forward with concrete recommendations, and therefore the G20 was created. That's the way how it happened. But this does give the G20 legitimacy to take decisions, to implement them. I have my doubts. So it's a sensitive question. I mean, just coming to a consensus, and then afterwards, of course, through the legitimate channels, in a consensus way, try to move things is a different thing. But to take the right to make decisions, I think this is still a question which is outstanding.
I see Mr. Sussman is looking at me. So let's look at the past 2 years, where the G20 did prove its capacity to both consider circumstances and develop plans and implement them is in response to the financial crisis. It was able to get the Basel Committee to act. It was able to get the Financial Stability Board to upgrade its capacity to produce a whole lot of rules. There's been, if you have to be frank, pushback from the banking sector in some regards, but at least there's been a coherent and systemic response to the crisis, as well as the collective response of each of the countries that engaged in one or other form of bailouts, or any more polite word you want to call it at this point in time. But in a sense, we're losing that momentum. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But there's another area where it still provides a very useful platform, and that is to continually monitor the global economy, to understand the risks that are actually emerging, to begin to develop with the IMF an early warning system in respect of some of those risks, and have at least a forum where those risks could be considered, if not just responded to as well. And I think that's a development that 3 years ago didn't quite exist in the form that we actually have it. Which are the areas that it could make a difference? The first is the infrastructure group. We now have the private sector involved. Will the action orientation of the private sector make a difference to that group? I hope it does. There are projects in Africa which the African Union has already agreed to, which different heads of state are sponsoring. So President Zuma from South Africa is supposed to be sponsoring and backing the North-South corridor. He's got a minister that's been designated to that process, officials that have been designated, and hopefully that synergy between the private sector and the public sector will begin to give us some tangible results sooner rather than later. Secondly, Maria mentioned the international monetary system. It's a difficult issue. There's a lot of geopolitical dynamics that are linked to that issue as well, but there's absolutely no doubt that there would be wide consensus that parts of that system don't work. Nobody's saying that the entire system doesn't work, but parts of that system doesn't work. Over the last year, there's been a lot of engagements, but we've come a long way from saying capital controls are not required at all to today having official IMF papers would say it's all right if certain circumstances are met. Even 6 months ago, we would look at only what receiving countries need to do of capital flows. Today, we can now say we need a set of rules for sending countries as well. We have at least an opportunity to look at the problem of excess liquidity within the global situation. And hopefully that begins to lead to an understanding that you require different modes of investment. And that's linked to the Africa and G20 issue as well, that if you take a long-term view of Africa, and indeed of developed economies as well, then you'll find money, or rather find opportunities where that money can in fact be invested. And I think the link that our Korean colleagues made between development and growth, which then links to the issues of health and education and other social services, is yet another opportunity. And your own foundation has played a great role in terms of vaccines development and so on. So there, if you can connect all of those dots, I think that those seem to demonstrate that in many areas there are practical things that are going on. They might be happening under different hats and different titles at this point in time. They don't necessarily all belong, if you like, to the G20, but those are nonetheless global efforts. And more we need to reinforce the idea that we need to work as a globe. And hopefully this combination of private sector, public sector, and the, let's call it NGO sector, might give us the formula which begins to take us forward.
Okay, I'm keen to, sorry, we'll have to close the session. I know that Maria wanted to say something. If you wanted to say something quickly to sort of wrap up.
Well, no, I think Minister Gordhan is just as captured it all. I just really wanted to make a point that, you know, the G20, the origins of it was in another financial crisis, as you may remember. It was in the, I know Peter's got this view that it started because of the frustrations in the UN. Yes and no, but the fact is that it started, its origins really were as a result of the Asian financial crisis. And, you know, I suppose in a multipolar world, you need structures that allow you to interact, to consult, to form opinions, to come up with solutions, to get to points which are binding without having, I suppose, the force of legal agreements, which is what you would get in the United Nations, and I think that's the